There was a sequel released in 1978 called Oliver's Story, which is like a direct sequel. Like he's playing the same guy and he's dealing with her loss, meeting a new woman in his life, played by Candice Bergen, based on Eric Siegel's sequel novel, which was released in 77. This film was very poorly received and not at all successful.
It was a bomb.
I think, and I haven't seen that. I didn't even know until last night doing my research that there was a sequel to this. I had never heard of that. Like I've heard of Love Story, big chunk of my life. It's one of my mom's favorite movies, Love Story. Okay. I had no idea that there was a sequel in novel version or in film version with Ryan O'Neal reprising his role. And apparently Ray Milland, his dad, is in the sequel too.
Oh, really?
So it's like a real deal sequel. Like it's not just like an in name only kind of a thing with new actors. It's like an actual sequel dealing with the aftermath. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, it didn't do very well.
People did not take to it.
Yeah, I think 8 years is too long, right? Like I feel like, okay, if you're going to make a sequel that, especially if it's like kind of dealing with his grief about the loss of Emily, that needs to come out within 2 years.
yeah. That's a very long time.
8 years later, he's grieving.
Well, and then I think you also have to look at, what were audiences' tastes in 1970 and what were audiences' tastes in 1978? I mean, just by looking at that,
super different.
I think you can look at that alone and say a movie like the sequel to Love Story would absolutely not fit. Film had changed. I mean, we already had gotten Jaws. We had already gotten Star Wars. All of those movies. And the movie-going audience 8 years later was a very different one. I mean, this was one of the most... I really think that the 70s, and each decade has, its own stamp, but the 70s in particular really seems to be that shift between movies of the 50s and the 60s, and then what we get in the 80s. Like the 70s is really where it overhauls. And it just seemed like, the Love Story to me just seems like it's very much a remnant of that
late
previous
60s,
era.
a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I made a similar note. I was like, this kind of feels like a late 60s film, like something that would have come out right after The Graduate, like 68, 69.
I was going to say that not thematically or, story-wise, obviously, but visually and stylistically, it reminded me a lot of The Graduate, which was 1967. I believe.
It's fall of 67, and that had kind of like an episodic kind of nature to it. Although I feel like the Mrs. Robinson section of The Graduate is like a whole different kind of movie than we get in Love Story.
Yes.
But I would say that like the last third of The Graduate kind of similar to Love Story. It's kind of a pretty young couple, and it's kind of episodic, and they're falling in love, but it might not work out. And I think The Graduate's a much better film than Love Story. I love The Graduate from beginning to end. This movie, I really, really liked it. I don't know if I'd say I loved Love Story, but it's a really strong piece of work.